We are accustomed to hearing heroic sagas about Vikings, filled with tales of brave warriors and daring explorers. However, often overlooked are the less savory aspects of their history: the thriving slave markets in Dublin and Hedeby, the ominous iron collars, and the silent mass graves. We are told about longships, but the human cargo they carried often goes unmentioned. Beneath the veneer of heroic expeditions lies systematic, profitable, and cold-blooded violence, primarily directed against women from ravaged villages. This was not merely a series of raids, but a brutal trade in mothers and daughters, reduced to commodities. Based on historical research and facts, supported by authoritative sources such as the Annals of Ulster and archaeological finds from Viking settlements, we will attempt to reconstruct the true picture of what transpired. The first act of this tragedy was the raid, swift and merciless. Imagine 9th century Ireland, small communities, farms, and monastery, nestled along the coast. Life here was governed by the rhythm of the seasons and tides. A centralized army or early warning system was out of the question. The only defense was the sea, which one day brought an unexpected terror known as strandhug, meaning shore strike. This was not a battle, but a brutal harvest. The year is 821. Howth, a small settlement on the Irish coast, a promontory jutting into the sea near modern-day Dublin. For mothers and daughters, it was an ordinary day, filled with familiar chores, mending nets, grinding grain, tending to children playing on the shore. Suddenly, the silhouettes of longships appeared on the horizon, rapidly approaching the shore. Ships with terrifying dragon heads on their prows, sitting low in the water, with a single sail and rows of shields along their sides, moved with frightening speed. The alarm was raised too late. Armed with axes and swords, the raiders landed on shore with deafening shouts. Men who tried to defend their homes were mercilessly killed. The rest were put to flight. The elderly and infirm were of no interest to the Vikings. They did not come for a prolonged battle, but for plunder, and the most valuable prize was people. The Annals of Ulster, a reliable chronicle compiled by Irish monks who witnessed these events, describe in detail the tragedy that unfolded in Howth. The chronicle states that the Vikings plundered the village and carried off many women. There is no ambiguity here. They took not only gold chalices from the local church, but also people. Women were the primary target, the most valuable resource. A young Norseman dreaming of his own farm and family in his harsh homeland needed enslaved women. A strong enslaved woman was more valuable than silver. She was a source of labor and a means of producing new labor, the foundation of a new life built on the ruins of her own. This was not an isolated incident, but part of a carefully devised strategy. Decades earlier, in 793, the raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in England shocked all of Europe. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle lamented the fiery dragons and heathens who lamentably destroyed God's church, but also took captives. 2 years later, they attacked Iona in Scotland, and then again in 806, leaving 68 monks dead. In every raid, alongside plundered gold and livestock, people were taken captive. Sagas, written centuries later, romanticized the image of the warrior, but the chronicles of the time dispassionately tallied the human cost. Women were separated from their children on the shore, their husbands killed before their eyes, their homes put to the torch. Bound, they were dragged onto longships, and their cries of despair drowned in the noise of the waves as the shore disappeared from view. Their former lives turned to smoke and ashes, and a new one, full of terror and suffering, awaited them. The second stage of this tragedy was the slave market. The journey itself was an ordeal. Captive women, stripped of their freedom, were confined to the holds of longships along with dozens of other unfortunates exposed to harsh North Atlantic winds and storms. Food and water were scarce, and diseases raged. This was the first stage of selection. Only the strongest survived this nightmarish crossing. Those who survived faced the fate of being sold in the growing slave trade centers that flourished in the Viking world. One of the largest such centers was Viking Dublin, or Dyflin, as the Vikings themselves called it. By the mid-9th century, it had become one of the largest slave markets in Western Europe. Imagine being led, chained, through the muddy streets of the settlement, your hands bound, your spirit broken. Archaeologists excavating in Dublin, in places like Fishamble Street, have uncovered tangible evidence of this trade. They found iron collars and chains, simple and brutal tools for controlling people. Some were sized for adults, others for children. These were not for animals, but for women and girls captured in places like Howth. In the slave markets, a mother could be sold one way and her daughter another. A girl's value was determined by her health, age, perceived strength, and what slavers cynically referred to as her beauty. Buyers inspected her teeth, felt her limbs, made her walk, and turned to ensure a profitable acquisition. The price fluctuated with supply and demand. After a successful raiding season, the market was flooded and prices fell. In lean years, a single healthy enslaved woman could be worth a fortune. The price of a human life in the Viking Age was measured in silver. Silver dirhams, minted in distant Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, served as receipts confirming active international trade. These coins, found in numerous hoards across Scandinavia, indicate that Vikings acted as intermediaries, capturing people in the west and reselling them to the east, utilizing the extensive network of Russian river routes. The 10th century Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who personally observed these markets on the banks of the Volga, left vivid testimonies. As an envoy of the Caliph of Baghdad, a representative of a highly developed and educated society, he was deeply shocked by the customs of the Rus traders. He noted their excellent physical build but was appalled by their hygiene and behavior. According to Ibn Fadlan, the traders shamelessly engaged in intimate relations with enslaved women intended for sale, right before the eyes of potential buyers, demonstrating a complete lack of moral principles. He bitterly stated, "The sale is conducted in this manner." This was a soulless business, a cold-blooded transaction in which human life lost all dignity and became a mere commodity. From Dublin to Hedeby in Denmark, from Birka in Sweden to the bustling ports on the Volga, the fate of these women was tragically the same. A woman's life no longer belonged to her. Now she only had a price. After being sold, a woman became a thrall, a Norse term for a slave. Her legal status was reduced to nothing. She became property, like livestock. In the harsh social hierarchy of the Viking Age, there were three clearly defined classes: jarls, wealthy aristocrats; carls, free farmers and traders who made up the majority of the population; and thralls, slaves, at the very bottom of the social ladder. Social mobility was virtually non-existent. If a person was born a thrall, they remained one for life. Her new life unfolded in a longhouse, a spacious, smoky, and crowded dwelling that she shared with her owner's entire family, and often with their domestic animals. She slept on the dirt floor or on a simple wooden platform, often next to livestock for warmth. Personal privacy was out of the question. Her days were filled with grueling labor. She rose before dawn to light the fire in the hearth. One of her main duties was grinding grain. Every day, she knelt for hours at the heavy quern, a hand mill turning the upper stone to produce flour for the day's bread. This monotonous and arduous work took a devastating toll on the body. Skeletal remains of women from this era often show severe arthritis in the knees, spine, and shoulders, a direct consequence of this exhausting work. She was also responsible for weaving on a large, upright, warp-weighted loom, producing woolen cloth for the family's clothing. She cooked meals, gutted fish, milked cows, cleaned the longhouse, and served her owner's family. Her work never ended. Later, Norse laws, such as the Gulating law of Norway, codified the legal status of the thrall. Legal codes treated the mutilation or killing of a slave as damage to property. If a free person killed another person's thrall, they paid a fine to the owner not as punishment for taking a human life, but as compensation for lost property, as if they had killed a cow. Violence was a constant reality in the lives of enslaved women. Archaeological finds of Viking-age skeletal remains in Norway attest to incredible brutality. One female skull from Saga shows massive blunt force trauma, a semicircular indentation that caused death. Nearly 40 skeletons examined in one study of remains from that era showed signs of violent death. As a thrall, a woman had no rights over her body. She was completely subject to the whims of her owner. Sagas, despite their often romanticized nature, contain numerous descriptions of the brutal treatment of slaves. Beatings were common, and sexual violence was not considered a crime. It was considered the owner's right. Thralls were given new names, often simple or derogatory, to sever the last connection to their home, family, and former life. She was meant to forget that she had ever been anything other than a slave. Another aspect of enslaved women's lives was forced motherhood. The constant demand for these women was driven by the harsh realities of Scandinavia. Some historical and archaeological evidence points to a practice of selective infanticide of female infants. In a harsh world where resources were limited, a boy was considered a future warrior and farmer, while a girl required a dowry for marriage. The Roman historian Tacitus mentioned a similar practice among Germanic tribes centuries earlier. Later, Icelandic sagas contain passages mentioning the practice of exposing unwanted infants, leaving them to die in the wild. While the reliability of these accounts is debated, a society with even a slight deficit of women faces immense social pressure. Viking men, especially those without land or high social status, needed wives and concubines to establish families, work the land, and produce heirs. Raids to capture women became a brutal solution to this demographic problem. A captured woman was not just a worker, she was a forced reproducer. Her children were key to the future of her owner's farm. Any child born to an enslaved woman and her owner inherited the mother's status. The child became a slave. This created a self-sustaining system of forced labor and sexual exploitation. Rape and forced labor were commonplace in the Viking Age. Mothers captured in Ireland or England watched in horror as their daughters, born into slavery, shared the same fate. Children who had never known freedom were raised to serve the legitimate heirs of their owners. This was not merely random cruelty, but a calculated economic strategy, allowing for the creation of new labor without additional costs, condemning entire families to slavery for generations. The psychological damage inflicted on these women is impossible to quantify. Giving birth in captivity, knowing that your child is property, living in constant fear of a son or daughter being sold, such was the harsh reality. Rare exceptions occurred when an owner granted freedom to a thrall and her offspring, a process known as manumission. This could happen if a legitimate wife could not produce an heir and a concubine bore a son. By freeing the son, the owner could recognize him as his legitimate heir. However, this was an act of self-interest, dictated by personal gain rather than compassion. Everything depended on the owner's whim. For most enslaved mothers and their daughters, there was no hope of salvation. The cycle of slavery was continuous, passed down from generation to generation. The history of tens of thousands of captive women has left an indelible mark not only in ancient books and archaeological finds, but also in the genetic code of entire peoples. This is irrefutable evidence of those terrible events. A large-scale genetic study of the Icelandic population conducted by researchers at Decoded Genetics in Reykjavik revealed shocking data. Analysis of mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child and the Y chromosome passed from father to son showed striking results. While most male settlers in Iceland were of Norse origin, an astonishing 62% of the original female settlers came from the British Isles, primarily from Ireland and Scotland. This figure indicates not a peaceful migration of families, but a genetic trace of generations subjected to raids and the slave trade targeting mothers and daughters. The men were primarily Norse colonists, and the women were their captives. Thus, the founding mothers of Iceland were, to a significant extent, enslaved women. A similar pattern is observed in other regions. Studies of the populations of the Orkney and Shetland Islands north of Scotland show a comparable history. The male lineage is predominantly represented by Norse DNA, while the female lineage has a closer connection to the indigenous population. Vikings arrived, killed or expelled local men, and took local women as spoils. These genetic data allow for a reinterpretation of Viking expansion. It was not just about exploration and finding new lands, but also about violent gender conquest. The women who were taken captive were not just passive victims, they brought their culture with them. Some scholars believe that elements of Gaelic language and folklore permeated Icelandic sagas through these captive mothers, telling stories to their children. However, their names and personal histories were lost, leaving only echoes in the blood, a silent testament to their suffering and survival. DNA serves as the final, impartial confirmation of what transpired. A tragic end for some of these women was a monstrous act demonstrating their status as property. The Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, in his detailed report from 922, left an eyewitness account of the funeral of a noble Rus on the Volga. After the chieftain's death, his body was placed in a temporary grave for 10 days while preparations for the funeral were made. The enslaved women were asked the dreadful question, "Who will die with him?" One girl volunteered. From that moment, she was treated with special honor, given beautiful clothes, and guarded by 2 other girls who attended to all her needs. She spent her days feasting and singing, being passed from tent to tent, where each of the deceased chieftain's privilegionach close associates had sexual intercourse with her, saying, "Tell your master that I did this out of love for him." Was this a choice made in absolute helplessness, a desperate attempt to find meaning, or coercion by tradition and pressure? Ibn Fadlan noted that at first the girl was cheerful, but as the day of cremation approached, she became quiet and frightened. On the last day, the chieftain's ship was pulled ashore, and a wooden platform built beneath it, covered with silk and Byzantine brocade. An old woman, called the Angel of Death, presided over the ritual. She was to kill the girl. The dead chieftain, dressed in his finest clothes, was placed in a pavilion on the ship. Weapons, food, the intoxicating drink, nabid, and the bodies of sacrificed animals, 2 horses, 2 cows, a dog, and a rooster were placed around him. Along with the chieftain, his wealth was sent to the afterlife. Horses, a couple of cattle, a loyal dog, and a proud rooster. The enslaved woman was led to the longship, where the final act of her earthly life awaited her. She parted with her bracelets, giving them to the grim Angel of Death. Her ankle ornaments she gave to 2 young maidservants, as if bidding farewell to her youth. Then she was forced to drain several cups of a strong drink, which clouded her mind. The girl tried to hide in the tent, but the old woman brutally pushed her back. A banging on shields erupted, and Ibn Fadlan asked the reason for this deafening noise. The interpreter uttered words that sent chills down his spine. "So that her screams do not reach the ears of other girls, lest it instill in them fear of inevitable death with their masters." Inside the tent, men surrounded her. 2 seized her legs, 2 others her arms. The angel of death placed a silk cord around her neck, passing the ends to two sturdy men. In the old woman's hands, a broad-bladed dagger glinted. While she was being strangled, the angel of death struck repeatedly, plunging the dagger between her ribs. Her life, stripped of value, became a public sacrifice. Her body was placed next to the body of the deceased chieftain. Then the closest relative of the deceased, naked, with a blazing torch in hand, approached the ship and set it on fire. Flames engulfed everything: the ship, the chieftain's body, his possessions, and the lifeless body of the enslaved woman. This was the apex of power and possession. Even in death, she did not belong to herself.